lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Austin Pelly, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And for the last several months, or for the last several weeks, we've been covering the crisis between the United States and Russia over the issue of Ukraine. And I guess you can add in NATO to that. You can add in the European states into that conversation. But basically, between NATO and Russia over the issue of Ukraine. This is coming to a head as both of these groups are prepared to confront each other at the United Nations over this particular issue. It doesn't necessarily seem too much progress has been made despite all of the conversations that's been taking place. However, this conversation is continuing, and I want to get to the latest. So joining us is Matthew Ehret. Matthew is a journalist and co-founder of Rising Tide Foundation. He's editor-in-chief of Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at American University in Moscow, and BRI expert for Rogue News and Tactical Talk. Matthew is a regular author to the Strategic Culture Foundation, The Cradle, Global Research, Lou Rockwell, Nexus, and The Duran. He's authored the 4 volumes, quote, The Untold History of Canada, unquote, and recently published a book series, The Clash of Two Americas. Matthew, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm very happy to be on.
I am very happy. Absolutely. We're very happy to have you. Thank you for joining us this morning. I want to get into what has been taking place over the weekend. So apparently, I guess 2 main things. One, the Ukraine has basically been trying to downplay and has been on some level undercutting the United States message of, this is an imminent, Russia is going to go in, et cetera, et cetera. And then you also have this thing where these guys are going to meet at the United Nations. And this is, of course, after the conversations between Lavrov and Blinken and the conversations between Russia and OSCE, or for that matter, Russia and NATO. It doesn't necessarily seem like anything has been coming to, let's say, any kind of agreement so far. What is your thoughts about this, especially the notion that this is going to be fought over in the United Nations Security Council?
Well, that's a great question. Indeed, as you pointed out, one of the most important formulas or parts of the formula for this whole scenario, this narrative to work, is Ukraine, and having Ukraine on board with the idea that an invasion is imminent, that Russia, we've been bombarded with this propaganda for weeks and weeks now, that there's 100,000 troops there, Russia will invade. And for all of this to work, it requires Ukraine to be on board. But the Ukraine defense minister, Reznikov, has thrown many, many wrenches into the machine by saying, well, actually, we don't have any evidence that this is happening at all. But that doesn't stop them, from pushing this idea that we need to have 8,500 troops ready to go and deployed to Ukraine. There's influxes of weapons. There's discussion of having 40,000 NATO troops as well sent. So there's a lot of evidence-free propaganda. And the way I think of it is largely as I heard the Star Trek reference in your previous segment. You have a Borg-like ideology right now, which is committed to an old script that showcased itself with the New World Order, right, of the early 1990s, when the Cold War finally came to an end, and supposedly that was the end of history. The growth of NATO was always an agenda. The NATO lost its purpose, but it kept on growing and growing and growing to the point that it nearly doubled its membership. And there were promises made to stop the growth of NATO. All of those promises were broken, and the intention was always to create this Borg-like, the world will be assimilated into this one world, rules-based liberal order. Now, the world doesn't work that way anymore. You have Russia, you have China, you have many other countries that have all said no to this idea of a unipolar hegemony. And instead, you have a multipolar alliance, which is formed, which is taking on vitality. Every single day, you have new projects announced, new integration of Eurasia around large-scale development. 140 countries have joined the BRI, and I would say that you just have a lot of stubborn ideologues in the West who refuse to accept the fact that the world has changed from the world that they thought existed a decade ago, and they have to play by a new set of rules. So no, I don't think much is going to come out of the current Blinken. To the degree that you have Blinken and these zombies representing U.S. policy, I don't think too much is going to come out of that. But I do think that you do have incredible cracks, systemic fissures in the Western system, where Croatia, a member of NATO, has said that they will not send troops. The Austrian foreign minister has said that this is insane, that there's no bearing in reality. Germany, and France have worked with Russia and Ukraine to restart the Normandy format talks. So you don't have any coherence in the Western system right now, which is not a bad thing. It had to sort of implode under its own self-contradictions at some point.
Yeah, that's great analysis, Matthew. It also brings me to other questions we've seen about. It seemed like with some blanket statements that were made from Biden in the past that, okay, the U.S. would consider, and we probably will, throw some troops in the border if Russia or throw some troops in Ukraine if Russia invades. And then that shifted to, well, it depends on the extent of the invasion. If we would really depends on like what our reaction would be. And then it shifted to, we will not commit any troops. And while he didn't necessarily say that he would initially off the bat, sure, he left that up in the air on purpose. Then he said, but they will be hit with hard sanctions, that the likes of which they've never seen before. I'm looking at some of these updates coming out of the UN Security Council that's meeting now, and it seems like, so the U.S. has prepared a list of Russian elites and families that they would hit with sanctions. So now, is this the extent of the hard sanctions, the likes of which have never been seen before? Let's just hit a couple people on essentially Wall Street, but for Russia. Right. And is that going to have the effect? Is that going to even save Biden on keeping that promise?
No, I think that a lot of this stuff is propaganda. And I mean, there's an incredible amount of bombast to the point that you even had high-level Western officials threatening to sanction Putin himself and Lavrov, which has never been that's never happened before. No, I don't think that they really wield the sort of economic clout as they, and when I say they, I mean the networks around Blinken, that they wish to believe that they do. Russia, in large measure, with China, with Iran, with others, have largely created an alternative financial economic architecture, and they know that the Western financial system is a big house of cards, which is going to crumble. It is crumbling as we speak, and that's why there's a fight, I think, to shape the terms and conditions of what Pepe Escobar calls globalization 2.0. The thing that was created, this time bomb that used to be our economy, this bubble of speculation based on securitized debts early in the 70s, this was going to blow at some point. This was an unsustainable thing. Now it's blowing. So there's a fight over what will be the new set of rules in the operating system, and will it be based upon national cooperation around large-scale projects, which is what we definitely see coming out, especially of the Far Eastern vision, the Arctic development strategies of Russia, the BRI projects of China, or is it going to be this other thing which involves getting everybody into a tiny little cage and setting it on fire as the cage maybe is induced to shrink? But I mean, the entire basis of Wall Street at this point in the Western economy is it can't survive without a fundamental shift towards a return to infrastructure and manufacturing to give the U.S. dollar vitality again, because right now, the U.S. dollar is a hyperinflationary piece of monopoly money, really. I don't even want to call it money. It's more monopoly money. And that's going to go poof. So, and Russia knows this. Everybody in positions of relevant leadership understand that this is the case, and it's a race against time. And I think that is an important factor shaping the conditions of this this obsession with creating a scenario in Ukraine, or as well a parallel scenario in Taiwan. That's part of the same package.
So what about how secure the British pound is then? Because we're seeing about 10 minutes ago, a representative from Bojo's clan. The UK is getting pretty war hungry with Russia. So it seems like the US now has the option to maybe step back a little bit with the sanctions that we've been touting that we would hit, because Boris Johnson says that he's going to hit Putin's inner circle hard with sanctions. And so if the U.S. is a hyperinflationary monopoly money, as you say, does the British pound hold more weight or less weight if they hit Russia with these sanctions?
Well, I think that, and sorry, I'm just fighting a little bit of a cold on my side. The Austrian foreign minister did call out the British secret diplomacy in particular in her recent speech, and the war euphoria for being sort of the arsonist fire starters behind the scenes. And I think that that's a very important thing to do, because looking back to world history, during the Cold War and even before that, people often underestimate the role of the British Foreign Office and the City of London as really very dominant influencers, even above many of the functions of the deep state embedded inside of the United States itself. So I think it's good to put the light on this thing. However, I think that Britain itself, being part of the international globalized system of speculative debt, which is what the City of London has always driven, I don't see it as necessarily capable. I think my analysis that I threw onto the U.S. and their bankruptcy also applies to the British pound, which is completely integrated into this bubble economy.
Matthew, let me ask you this. From the United States, or from the media in the United States, NATO is always presented as a defensive union. And basically, you know, even the argument of it's open door policy, this is just a defensive unit, nobody needs to worry about anything. And so from the U.S. press, that's kind of the image that NATO is given. That's not the image that Russia basically has of NATO, though. What's wrong with that argument in making and presenting NATO in that, you know, peace lily fashion?
Oh yeah, that's pure psyop. I mean, when you actually look at, if you put yourself in the shoes of a Russian military strategist or statesman like Putin, and you look at the growth of NATO on your perimeter, especially since 1991, when there were agreements to, and these agreements were never written down in writing, which is part of why Putin has put forth his red lines currently since December 15th, demanding that something be put into writing, because we only have the testimony of people like Robert Gates, when he was part of the discussions and negotiations between Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and the West, to not encroach upon Russia's perimeter under the conditions that they dissolved the Soviet Union. Now, that didn't happen. Instead, what we've seen is not only a takeover of many of these former Soviet bloc countries by George Soros, open society operations, which completely liberalized their economies, created little local oligarchies by mass privatizations, shock therapy across the board. It wasn't just Russia. But then there was also the forward basing of an anti-ballistic missile shield, which every strategist that has an opinion worth anything has made the point that these are not purely defensive. They can be converted into offensive systems relatively easily. And people like Sergei Glaziev, an advisor to the Russian government, has made the point that this is in many ways tied to an idea of full spectrum dominance, with not only a chain of missiles around Russia's southern perimeter, their soft underbelly, but also around China. And we've seen this with especially Obama's Asian pivot in 2013, where there's over 100,000 U.S. troops around China's perimeter in the Pacific, and basings of THAAD missiles and other things like that in Japan, in South Korea especially, is where the THAADs are located. And it's all, again, one thing, because China and Russia have a bond of survival, and that is unbreakable as it stands. But it is not a peace force in any way, and we've seen that with Libya, was blown up under NATO, the NATO alliance, for no good reason whatsoever. Libya had nothing to do with what they were accused of. And so, yeah, I think that the entire veneer that NATO is a defensive bloc is crumbling very fast.
This might be a one-off question, but it would be amiss to not bring up the gas and wheat that comes from Russia that seems to be their main exports that everyone's worried about. If we engage in a war, or if we impose some dramatic sanctions, then they can just say, okay, Germany, you freeze now, and switch a lever in the bottom of the Kremlin. But I'm interested now that the Wall Street Journal came out about an hour ago and said that wheat prices are globally on the rise. They're up about 7%, and they're expected to just double in prices pretty much any day now. Which is, the 6-7% is about a decade high. And while we're getting hit with some major inflation here in the States, but we might be able to afford this shift. I'm curious what it's going to do to the global market and the global food supply. And then also, do you think that this is from Russia purposely either decreasing the amount of food coming out of them, grain coming out of their country, or do you think that this is just a byproduct of them having to focus so much energy and attention on NATO, on the UN, over Ukraine, or just what's your take on that?
That's a good question. I do tend to. I'm not too sure about some of the dynamics behind the wheat issue of Russia and the wheat production falling off. What I do know is that there's two interconnected crises in terms of the energy crisis, especially across Europe, where, I mean, it's bad everywhere, but Europe, I mean, in many places, it's 300% higher in terms of average energy prices than it was last year, same time. And it's a question of, during the context of a cold winter, an inability to sustain affordable energy and reliable energy to your people, you are going to cancel, which is what the current new government has been talking about, is postponing and even potentially canceling Nord Stream 2 and also shutting down nuclear power, shutting down fossil fuels and every other thing as well, in order to put all of their reliance into so-called renewable energies, which itself is highly, highly expensive, very, very unreliable, especially when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and winter is a bad time for solar panels. So you've got a perfect storm, which is either incompetent or it's calculated to create scarcity. I'm personally of the more conspiratorial view in this, that there is a calculated intention to create scarcity within the transatlantic community as part of a broader push to get rid of the nation-state system, which has been going on now for decades and decades. And this is when I said at the beginning that there has been an old script that certain unipolarists refuse to let go of. It's the idea that the old sovereign nation-state system that, you know, we've been living with for many generations, that is obsolete. We need a new global technocratic elite to manage the scarcity. And and in the context of that, Russia, China, even every country in Europe has to be taught a lesson. So, you know, I don't think Russia wants to create that scarcity at all. If anything, you know, Russian production of gas flows to Europe have increased by 10% over last year. So this idea that they're creating scarcity, which has been promoted in all sorts of media outlets, left and right alike, it doesn't hold up to the test of reality itself. As far as the wheat production is concerned, I don't really know so much about that one, so I'll refrain from commenting.
Let me ask you this. From Moscow's standpoint, I mean, Blinken, well, the United States and NATO basically gave a written response to Russia's security concerns. That was one of the things that Lavrov said that Moscow wanted. And it didn't necessarily seem that the security concerns were being addressed in the written response. And of course, that, you know, there's always this thing that we're not just going to talk all day, meaning we're not going to have these conversations just for the sake of conversation. What is going to be the next step here for Moscow? I mean, if they don't necessarily believe they're being listened to in regards to the things that they say they wanted, their security guarantees. And by the way, I don't even think it's all that outlandish for Moscow to basically say, look, here are our issues. We need to deal with these issues. You guys are encroaching closer and closer to our territory, especially considering the way you guys responded during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is basically just the reverse of that. What's the next step, though, from Moscow's standpoint? Or for that matter, yeah, let's go with that question. What is Moscow's next step in this kind of negotiation that's taking place? And is that next step tangible? Meaning, does it go beyond rhetoric? And if it does go beyond rhetoric, what is it?
Well, excuse me. I think that Lavrov, and I recently read the transcript of a recent speech he gave just 2 or 3 days ago, and he's keeping his cards pretty close to their chest when he was asked this very question: "What is your next step exactly?" I think that it's a wise thing to do, and I don't think we know exactly what their next step will be. However, they've already pushed a lot of the pus to the surface by simply putting out this demand for an open dialogue around reality instead of tiptoeing around around niceties, which have no bearing in reality, right? That the U.S. wants to spread democracy and NATO is just defensive. No, Putin just made it very clear. Lavrov made it very clear that they want red lines. There will be repercussions to breaking them, and Lavrov made a point that there were useful things said by Blinken in terms of an openness to agree to not have military exercises on the border of Ukraine or what have you. And Lavrov made the point, like, this is not a U.S. invention. They just took things that Russia has been proposing for many, many years and just slipped these reasonable things into the agreement. But otherwise, Blinken's response is that every country has a right to choose whether it joins NATO or not. And this open door, idea of NATO being open to everybody is being treated like sacrosanct, sacred, whereas Russia simply wants a return back to the Helsinki Act, the Istanbul Act of 1999, of 2010 in Astana, which is just indivisible security. We cannot have one region's security interests get met at the deprivation of the security interest of another region in the world. It doesn't work that way. So I don't know what Russia's next response is going to be. They have some incredible technologies. Putin has already overthrown the rules of the game since 2018 when he first announced these next generation supersonic missiles and other delivery capabilities that have given a strong message to the Western idiots who think that they could win in a limited thermonuclear war and destroy Russia's response capabilities under the context of a nuclear attack. And Putin just unveiled a whole armory of new types of advanced technologies that prove that that's not the case, that cannot happen. These game theory, video games, scenarios do not bear in any way. So are there other similar technologies that can be brought online or that are ready to be brought online? Probably. I don't know what those are. Russia is very serious, though. They are not going to just sit around and wait as their, that NATO encroaches onto Ukraine or absorbs Georgia or other things. So I don't really know. I don't know. Like
Matthew,
I said,
if I can jump in here,
to their chest.
Sorry about that. Yeah. I just want to get in this last question here. You were talking about. I'm glad that you said that you lean on this conspiratorial side on some of these things, because I wanted to pose one to you here. I was under the impression that if Russia invades Ukraine, it would be in their best interest to do it rather soon, because they have the ability to move within a couple hours' notice. They can switch up their formations, and they already have troops there. And the longer they wait, the more posturing NATO can do around surrounding countries, the more weapons we can send and all that. Even though Russia still might be able to overrun Ukraine, there's no amount of support that we could add to prevent that if they so desired. But then you were talking about disruption of the global power dynamic. I'm wondering now, does it behoove Russia to extend this issue out and sow the seeds of discord within NATO and the UN? Because now we're seeing the UK and Germany butt heads, because the UK wants Germany to commit more into this affront, and Germany's worried about their own interests. We're seeing some issues between France and the US on their own invested interests when it comes to Russia. So does it now behoove Russia to break up NATO by allowing all of these hardly allied countries to infight between them?
Well, I don't think that Russia needs to do very much per se to break up NATO, because NATO, by its own, as I pointed out, self-contradictions built into it, is breaking up itself. They're cannibalizing their own existence, and the infighting is only going to grow as the fissures grow. Excuse me. We know, again, Russia knows that the financial system that the West is sitting on is going to blow. They have, I think, a certain sense that countries, as that fire that is already engulfing our home is going to be felt more and more by the people who have been induced to live inside their home and call it globalization and think it's this comfortable thing. That fire is starting to touch people now. People will increasingly, nations across Europe are increasingly going to want to avoid being destroyed in the context of that. And whether that means being caught in the middle of a nuclear exchange, or whether that means avoiding having your financial system blown out, there is an alternative. And I think that that's the important thing in this whole mix, is that especially because of China's controls of their national banking system and large-scale development, which operates in a very different way from the IMF, World Bank, Western system, they're actually building things that have real value. Matthew, that looks a lot more like the
I hate to cut in.
What's that?
I hate to cut in, but we're going to have to close it. We're running up against the hour. But thank you. I really appreciate you joining us. Great conversation.
Sure, of course.
Matthew Eder is a journalist and co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. He's editor-in-chief at Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at American University of Moscow, and BRI expert for Road News and Tactical Talk. He's a regular author to the Strategic Culture Foundation, The Cradle, Global Research, Rockwell. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Pelly. Back in a moment.